Hi, and good evening. My name is Amanda Hollowell, and I am the Director of Strategic Campaigns for Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. I am also a board member of the Georgia Alliance for Social Justice. This evening, for our Decode the Debate discussion, we're talking CRT. We're talking about race isn't racist. And we've got some great panelists tonight. We have Dr. Stevens Owens, who is a senior policy analyst at GBPI, where he focuses on state policy and research that affects public K through 12 education in Georgia. He graduated from the University of Georgia, where he holds a doctorate with a focus on education policy. Stevens' dissertation centered on state level agenda formation. We also have Noah Changa. Noah Changa is an independent journalist based in Atlanta, focusing on electoral justice, voting rights, politics, and culture. A retired attorney at such a young age. She was also the host of the Way with the Noah podcast. Noah has bylines in several outlets, including News One, Harper's Bazaar, Truth Out, The Appeal, Essence, and Scallywag magazine. Thank you for joining us this evening, both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes. And so just to kind of get right into it, as a little housekeeping, we will be asking the panelists questions, but we want to hear from the community. So make sure you put in the comments your questions, and we will try to answer those in our Q&A section after our panelists close. But we're going to start off right where we need to, which is the education side of this. So, Stephen, I literally don't understand how we got here. And so if you could just give me a little background of why are we having this conversation in Georgia?
That's a great question, and a bigger question than one I would have time for. I can say that Georgia's General Assembly, the time when legislators show up in Atlanta and are allowed to make laws, goes from early January to right before April. The other reason that's pertinent is because a lot of the debate around the idea of critical race theory in K-12 schools started after that. We saw it in other states, in Arizona and Texas and in Florida. And that's important because the governor of the state of Georgia, Brian Kemp, then wrote a letter to the State Board of Education asking for critical race theory. He called it an ideology, a dangerous racist ideology, and asked for it to be banned from public schools and from the curriculum in Georgia. And a little bit of this, a not small amount of that, was absolutely posturing, just based purely on the fact that the State Board of Education, while they finalize curriculum at the end of the day, the idea that there is some vast amount of graduate level legal theory inside our K through 12 curriculum is preposterous. And the State Board of Education, which is appointed by the governor, not all by Governor Kemp, but some by Governor Deal before him, then passed a non-binding resolution. I have it over here. It does not explicitly name critical race theory. It's a lot about how the state of Georgia isn't racist, or how the United States isn't racist, and how you shouldn't be talking about things in civics or history that are too debatable in current events, which, if turned into law or rule, would be very difficult to enforce. And also, imagine talking about the Holocaust. Imagine talking about slavery and its impacts in Georgia if you couldn't talk about controversial issues. There is talk about making some of these things rules or laws in our next session, but the reason that we might see a tamped down version of that is because that would require public comment. And even though we had an entire State Board of Education that was appointed by 2 Republican governors, there was still a good deal of debate on whether or not they should pass that resolution. There were 2 nay votes. And I'm not sure policymakers want to open up this sort of discussion to public comment because of a fear of the population and a fear of the state of Georgia and its voters. But so that's how we got to where we are today, just kind of a response to national trends and a non-binding State Board of Education resolution.
Thank you. And so I think, with that bigger picture you know, can we get a definitive answer? Is CRT in our education system in Georgia?
Yeah, so this is the difficult part of it, because as we're debating this, Amanda and I work for GBPI, where we are advocating for an anti-racist future where more Georgians thrive. The difficulty here is, like, on one hand, you want to say, like, first of all, this is not being taught in Georgia schools. That there are standards and curriculum that are provided to teachers that are tested regularly, which teachers are held accountable to by their assistant principals and their principals. And nowhere does critical race theory show up, definitely explicitly not. But on the other hand, our students and a lot of our teachers, a lot of our populace, and myself could really benefit from many of the things that critical race theory brings. But like, the simple answer is no, because this is like next level graduate level thought on the persistence of white supremacy in the legal order. And that's a really high. I bet there are some private schools that teach some tenets of critical race theory, but like, on one hand, you want to say, like, why are y'all doing this? You know, it's not even inside Georgia schools. And on the other hand, you want to say, like, it could really benefit our civics and social studies classes for students to understand things like the convergence theory, the idea that Black people have gained rights in the United States only when it converges with the interests of white people. That is a helpful heuristic to begin debate around Brown v. Board of Education and similar legal victories. And so the short answer is no.
And I appreciate that. And I also appreciate that you actually gave real-time, real examples of what critical race theory is, right? And because I feel like, you know, we talked about that in our letter with Fund Georgia's Future Coalition. We are making this the boogeyman. And for no unapparent reason other than to divert the conversation rather than really talking about what is needed in education in Georgia. So I think that for me, like, this is a great segue with you. Like, what are we losing by overly focusing on this? Like, what are the opportunities lost in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we have lived with for a long time in the state of Georgia. And by the we in this, I mean, Georgians have lived in this state for 20 years, where 18 of the last 20 years, the state has cut funding to public schools and not even met the minimum requirement to say that we have funded public schools to the tune of $10 billion have been cut from public schools over the last 2 decades. So you can kind of see a scenario where a policymaker, you mentioned that I wrote my dissertation on agenda setting. A big part of agenda setting is creating a problem, problematizing something, and then you come up with a solution for it. So if you do not like the debate around education funding, because it is difficult, because it would require actually raising revenues, it would require realizing that there is a need that has been caused by centuries of white supremacist policies and ableism and racism, that is such a difficult issue. It's much easier to create a boogeyman and then say you have now defeated said boogeyman. But we tried to make the case that there are actually things that are hurting children today, specifically those children whose voices and rights have been suppressed. So we're talking Black and brown communities, we're talking students with disabilities, English language learners. And those are policies that we could be coming together and working for solutions from, like meeting their needs via the budget, like taking down barriers like onerous discipline policies and the fact that we still only test in English, so that a child who arrives in our state not speaking English would have no idea what they're doing when they're sitting in front of this test. We could take down those barriers, but instead we are shifting towards this boogeyman and then saying, okay, I took care of all the monsters under your bed. When there are like actual real policies like school funding, like the over-police presence and the over-disciplining of Black and brown children in our schools. But those would just take difficult conversations and would actually take, working together across across the spectrum to do something like that, and would cost money.
Money, which is like the thing, right? I feel like we're wasting so much energy and good paid media to have these conversations, which gives me time to give space to Noah, which is, you wrote this amazing article recently about like how this played out in Arizona. I really want to kind of dig into that, which was, so outside of the education fight, how is this playing out in like the political landscape?
Yeah, I just want to piggyback real quickly on something that Stephen said about like what is missing from kids. I just did this amazing interview with some youngsters connected to an organization called, I think it's called America's Promise. But there was a research report that just dropped yesterday. I have an article coming out about it, hopefully tomorrow. And they were just talking about like the focal points of actual high school students and teenagers who've gone through this pandemic. And I'm getting to your question, but like to Stephen's point, like race and racism is something that these kids have been living through like very clearly, whether they're Black and brown students and that's part of their everyday lives, or they're white students in community and going to school with Black and brown students who are also very much feeling what has been happening over the past year and a half and putting that in context with other experiences they've had earlier. I mean, we also have a generation that is like enduring extreme mental health issues right now as a result of the isolation, of the separation from their peers, the stress of COVID-19, just so many other things. So there's so much our elected officials and just leadership should be focusing on right now, other than, like you all were saying, creating this education boogeyman. Now, to what you were asking about what's going on outside of education, I would say that, the politics, education is heavily political, right? So the article you're referencing is a piece I wrote for News One after learning about a meeting that was happening to specifically attack a Black woman who was on the school board of the Chandler School District in the Greater Phoenix metro area. And it was all because, Lindsay Love is someone, she went to attend an urban school board conference that's going to be held here in Atlanta, or in Atlanta later in September. And, everything from, well, we're not an urban school district, because, urban for some people is a code word. And they didn't understand, but it's very much an urban area. And so, but then some of it like leaned into critical race theory. We shouldn't be supporting critical race theory. We shouldn't be doing this. Why is she doing that? She even got attacked during the meeting by one of her colleagues on the school board. But we're seeing this happening at school boards. I later learned from talking to Lizzie, there are two other Black women in the immediate Phoenix metro area who also sit on school boards who have had similar attacks on them. We have Black women in the Black electeds in the metro area, right, in Cobb and Gwinnett County, who have had similar attacks. We had the Cherokee County, I think it was a diversity person that they were bringing in that decided that they weren't going to mess with the school district anymore. So we have seen how this is, whether it is parents who actually know that they are distorting this concept, or they are parents who are relying on what they view are good or trustworthy sources or whomever, and getting really upset about what they perceive as a harm to their kids. Now, as a parent, because I know folks get real like, well, you don't understand. I have two teenagers, right? And I am actually sitting in Charleston, West Virginia right now, across the street from my kids' elementary school, where at the age of 10 in the 5th grade, my daughter was traded as a slave. Now, her teacher wasn't racist. She was a very nice woman. I mean, she had her stuff. We all have our issues with some teachers sometimes, but she was a very nice woman. And she got very defensive when I, had addressed this with her and the principal. My daughter came home because my daughter was traded for rum so that her classmates could sell more rum to be able to pay their taxes. It was a triangle trade exercise. And at no point did she ever kind of really have a check-in with the kids about what was going on. The only thing that was ever said about slavery, besides the fact that kids were divided into a group as slaves, was the fact that we're not going to get to slavery to the Civil War. Now, mind you, they're learning about the Revolutionary War, the prelude to the Revolutionary War. So it's like, almost 90 years of U.S. history until they're going to talk about slavery, which is ridiculous. So my kid, because she grows up in a household with the family that she has, comes home and tells me about this. And I just found the emails not too long ago that 30-year-old Noah had written to the principal. I was very proud of myself. But really breaking down down for them that it's not about whether or not they themselves were racist. It's the fact that they didn't have the understanding. So this is where we get to equity in education, right? And this is what so many people on these school boards and in these meetings are being attacked for. Not critical race theory. That's just something that's been thrown out there by conservative provocateurs to get everyone hyped up. Really, what ultimately folks want to get out, they want to get equity in education, anti-racist education out of schools. But you have stories like my child who, I'm explaining this to a friend of mine, again, 10 years ago, I'm in West Virginia, explaining this to a white friend. We're all driving to dinner. And she's like, what? She turns to her daughter and said, did they do that in your class too? She was like, yeah, I wish I had more slaves though, because I had high taxes and I needed more rum to sell. And these are 10-year-olds. And my friend is like pale and like apologizing, but it wasn't their fault. The kids didn't get the context. And so when you don't have that equity lens, you don't have the context and understanding of how to actually teach these issues in a way that doesn't make a kid like mine. People keep talking about they don't want kids to feel bad. You have kids like mine. We have accounts all the time, whether it's kids doing racist things on their own in the school or in group chats or whatever, or the school districts themselves. We had a school district in North Carolina a few months ago. They had the kids recreate tweets from the Confederate era of what slave owners would be tweeting about. Why is that a useful assignment? When you don't have a lens to think about those things, then you do stuff that's ultimately harmful, because you had kids like tweeting, like making tweets like slavery for life. The broader community was outraged because they posted it because the kids were very proud. They were like third or fourth, they're like fourth graders or something like that. Kids don't know any better. Kids know what we teach them. And that is part of the problem we're seeing right now, right? So with what we're seeing is these attacks on school board members because they are very vocal about equity in education. And what that means is that we make sure that kids, regardless of race, ethnicity, national origin, disability, gender orientation, whatever it is, we make sure kids have what they need. So if your kid has an IEP, then your school has the resources to make sure that your child is getting the resources that they need to be successful. Because we want all kids to thrive. You and I don't have to have the same political agenda. We don't have to have the same political understanding for me to want your babies to do well too. You know what I'm saying? And that's where we're having this thing happening, right? So you have these people who are like concerned parents. And so what I found from talking with the folks in Arizona, and at least there out in the Southwest, some of what we're seeing right now is really just been building. It's not a new thing. This has come from the Red for Ed movement when we saw all the teachers some years back in the strikes and like people really demanding better for education. You know, you had some of these more conservative leaning groups forming, and then they kind of morphed into these anti-COVID mask mandate, go back to school groups that are now taking on the banner of critical race theory. So when people say things like, we're not really sure what the motivations are, it's possible that individual parents and people who are being encouraged to give comments, you might not know those people's individual motives, but we do, NBC News, actually, I believe it was last week, did a very good deep dive, and I can give it to our moderators to drop it in the chat for you all, about like some of the funding and background. You know, Heritage Action, which we already saw within the last month or two, admitting that it's been behind some of the voting rights provisions that have been so atrocious. We also now, or voter suppression provisions, we also see them putting out a guidebook on how to combat. There are guidebooks, like a Fox News article actually had linked to 2 of these resources as well that you have. Sorry, there are puppies that have now run into the room. They want to get in on the education thing too. But we have these guidebooks that are being put out that are, you know, with the language, like critical race theory is a code word, and it's like a list of other phrases. And I haven't wanted to publish them directly, and because I don't want to give people clicks, but I can drop the links for folks to share to see this stuff, because this is not just conspiracy theory. This is a very real thing, because I think the NBC News article quotes Steve Bannon as saying the way to taking back America is through the school boards. And so there has always been a battle for education, right? When you think back to who has been allowed to even have education or pursue education in this country, whether it's on race, gender, economic status, etc., it has been very political since the creation of the United States of America. Even we thinking about, you know, how schooling, you know, Stephen mentioned Brown versus Board of Education. We still have not had the full promise of what Brown versus Board of ed actually even stands for. So we see this across so many areas. And again, it's not just like, we're not trying to make, I've heard people say things like, I don't want my kids to feel bad. We learn a lot of stuff in school that can be heavy already. And this is actually something one of the students I interviewed for the report actually said to me. We learned a lot of things. He was like, he went to a school where he actually learned about the Trail of Tears. Thankfully, we have heard so many different things already. We've learned, our kids learn about Japanese internment, right? So to actually have honest education, that doesn't make them feel bad. That's why we have the discussion and the conversation and the wraparound, community, so that kids aren't, the purpose is not to make people feel bad about themselves. It's quite the contrary. What they found in the report from America's Promise is actually that the 2,500 or so high school students that they interviewed is that kids overall had a greater sense of connectedness to community when they had a better understanding of these issues. Because it's confusing. It's confusing for adults. So of course it's confusing for kids. So that's some of the stuff I've been tracking. I mean, there's been so much focus on what the legislative folks were doing that I think the school board attacks have been flying kind of under the radar. There was also a lawsuit that was in Massachusetts because after, I think it was the Atlanta spa shootings, actually, there was a school district that decided that it was going to have safe spaces available for Asian students in particular, but students of color generally, for them to go to be able to like collect, because that was a very scary moment, right? For us here, for folks in the metro area, particularly for our AAPI folks, and so other folks around the community. And so a group of conservative parents, not from that district even, sued because they said that was reverse racism to make space for a group of students to come together, right? And so we see this type of thing happening. And there was actually a professor that dug in from Massachusetts that kind of dug into like where their funding is coming from. So that's the other thing. Like you might have a group of parents that are concerned. They might have seen something online or heard something on whatever show they watch. But if you look at some of the labels on flyers, like, there's a group, it's like no left. It's something about getting the left out of our schools or education. You need to start looking to see like what the funding is and where it's going, because there is very much a very clear through line between we're looking at what's happening with the different types of legislation that's moving forward, whether it's the anti-protest, anti-voting rights, this push to end this critical race theory. When we're coming on the heels and we're talking about what has happened politically on the national level, it's very much trickling down at the state and local level as well. Sorry, that was a lot.
But it was important because you took us there. So, right, like we got to hear your perspective as a parent, you sharing that experience of what your child went through. Like, thank you, because now folks are sharing in the comments. And I think one of the things like you kind of touched on, but I really want to like you to expound, is like, how did this gain momentum? Like, yes, we know Fox shared the packet, but like, how was this shit? How did we get to the place where now we're at like national meetings and a general is being questioned about critical race theory?
Well, I mean, right? Like, so that's why it's hard to believe that any of this just happens. It's just coincidence, right? I think when we look back, actually, about 30 years or so now, you look back actually to when former President Bill Clinton had actually nominated law professor Lonnie Guinier. We're talking about critical race theory, and it comes out of mostly Black legal practice, but it's in other advanced academic areas as well. But Lonnie Guinier, that was a part of some of the attacks on her to derail her from being the first Black woman to hold a position that now Kirsten Clark holds, right? And so this has been like a little thing in certain circles. It was more, not so much fringe, but it was not as mainstream as it becomes now. What we see happening now, what we see being disseminated through these various parent groups and stuff, that's what I'm saying. Like there are parents groups that have already existed that have opposed, having Indigenous Peoples Day and things of that nature already. But this is coming together in a more organized fashion. And what we're seeing, post 2016 election is just the way how organized disinformation networks and misinformation as an organizing tool has been used in conservative spaces. And so again, there may be people, you know, for folks who are watching, who are in your community, who are in your classroom, whether or not y'all are exactly on the same page in terms of politics, there may be people that you can actually reach in terms of like, here's some good information about what this is and isn't. Here's why saying like anti-racism is important. And it's not, anti-racism is not anti-whiteness. Even talking about whiteness is not anti-whiteness, right? When I think back to all my years in West Virginia, I lived in West Virginia a total of 8 years, 7 years of my adult life. And I think back to like how isolated and insular things have been because of, you know, control mechanisms implemented by, you know, coal barons and just industry bosses. That is like a really harmful thing that has happened to people here that needs to be talked about in the greater context of like white supremacy and capitalism and all those other great things people talk about. That's not to make people feel bad about themselves. These are people here who are very self-sufficient and self-determined, but need that support and backup. And so we need to have real conversations about history, not just for Black and brown folks and other people of color. Like, we need to have real conversations about history so people understand that the current conditions that may not be great for most of us don't have to be this way and haven't always been this way. So when we're talking about like, how have we gotten here? I mean, some folks will point to, I think it's like a conservative writer or blogger who like sometime last year at the start of the pandemic really started like making these like leaps and connections and claims and things like that, because you will see people claiming like white fragility, the book White Fragility is critical race theory. It's not. You will see people saying like so many different things. Well, that's critical race theory. It really isn't. And like Stephen said, like I think this is a meme too. Like if your kid is learning critical race theory, congratulations, they're in law school. I mean, most law schools don't even teach it. Like I learned about critical race theory 2 ways. One, through independent study in a either upper level undergraduate course. That's my son in the background getting out the puppy. I think in grad school, I did some work. I was looking at, you know, like gentrification and spatial development and stuff. And so Whiteness is Property, which is like an 80 or 90 page law review article by Professor Cheryl L. Harris, which trust and believe your kid is not reading in K through any elementary, high school, or middle school grade at all. You're not reading law review articles at all, which a lot of this stuff is. The other way I learned about it is my godmother has taught racism in the law, which was, and originated by the late Professor Derek Bell, who's considered like the father of critical race theory. So these are concepts and ways of analyzing and understanding things, not like something that's going to teach us that the white man is the devil. And I understand that there may be people on the internet who say and think that, but that's not at the crux. And that's definitely not what's happening in our public schools or even in our universities. Because what we're seeing happening right now, and there's no way that we can say, we can look at like the Heritage Action, which we already know has coordinated efforts with legislative bodies, conservative legislative members across the country, as evidenced by their work on voting rights. Like, there's no way we can say when we see things like in Kansas, the state legislator demanding that public university professors send them their syllabi so they can understand whether or not critical race theory or anti-racism, whatever is being taught. And we now have Governor DeSantis in Florida demanding to do a survey of people's political beliefs that are teaching in public universities. I think it's just the teachers, not also the students, but still, this is the type of thing that we're heading towards. And this is allegedly the type of thing that America is supposed to be standing against in terms of how do we protect freedoms. Academic freedom and freedom of speech and freedom of expression are supposed to be like paramount, right there. That's in the first 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights. So it's very suspicious what's happening. And we shouldn't look at this as like, oh, this is just some random thing that's happening. It's a very controlled, organized effort. And like I said, I'll drop for the moderators the NBC article that goes a little bit more detailed into like some of the organizations directly behind this.
Thank you, Anoa. And I would say, so right now, like you are the person who's in the media and understand national media. What do you think right now the role media could play? I mean, like, I know we could go on and on and on, but maybe just like you could talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly in this moment as before we move into like an open Q&A. Because unfortunately, a lot of people are getting their sound bites and their tidbits from media.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the problem is I know like folks often have this balancing act, right? Because you don't want to demonize people because you don't want to lose them. But at the same time, when we spend time doing like both sides, or we don't know, or like I really actually read a guide for journalists earlier today about 4 tips on how to cover critical race theory, and there was a whole line or two in there about like we're not really sure where people are getting this from. Yes, we know where people are getting this from. It's been documented across multiple different articles at this point in time. To say otherwise is disingenuous, right? You're doing your readers a disservice. What we can do is just put the facts out there, right? Like Stephen had laid out earlier on, like, you know, critical race theory is an upper level graduate law school concept that maybe if you're really like, you know, advanced undergraduate, you might be taking as an independent study type of thing, but it's not something that's even taught in most, you know, upper level programs, let alone on undergraduate campuses. And let's just be real, in college, people elect most of their classes. So if your kids are being indoctrinated, they're doing it by choice. But when we are talking about what the media can do, the media can make sure they're talking to people who are actually experts in these fields, and not just in terms of like law professors or other folks who are not even practitioners. You can't be a practitioner really because it's a framework. It's not like a political or religious practice or anything, but people can get those basic facts about it right. And we can stop allowing people to make claims that we know to be untrue. So we know that when people just talk about diversity and inclusion generally as being synonymous, that needs to be shut down. Diversity and inclusion, there are studies. It's actually a very valid, equity is a very valid thing. I mean, critical race theory is also a very valid thing to have and understand and engage with, but that's not what they're not necessarily really worried about that, right? They know it's amorphous. They know they don't know what it means. They know they can't really describe it. If you ask people who are law professors who do racism work to describe it, you might get like, if you ask 10 people, you might get 10 different answers because it's not a stagnant, simple one thing. That's why they connected to things like diversity and inclusion, equity, just all these real basic things. Centering, like I'm dropping the guidebooks and stuff in here for y'all to look for yourself, but like literally words like centering, that's critical race theory. Like things like this, it's exacerbating. So, I mean, media really needs to point out like what is happening, how these different groups are being ginned up to go after and attack. Like school board members need to be protected, quite honestly. You have, we need to be covering and letting people know that you do have like areas where people are trying to recall entire school boards. Like, so a recall election, remember when they tried to recall the governor in Wisconsin? They're trying to recall entire school boards on the fabricated charge that they're trying to endanger white children or make them to believe that one race is more superior to the other, when that's literally not what anyone is doing. So media has such a critical role in democracy in general, but in particular with this issue, media can do a lot better with informing people about what is happening, what isn't happening, and talking to people who can help folks engage better. Because ultimately, it sounds like we have some parents who might be wanting to get more involved in their schools. And, you know, school is a cute thing to say, but like school has never just been school for a lot of our children. And that's why we need more folks to go along. So I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda, but media has a lot it can do. And folks need to be really careful about what sources they're using and who they are sharing from. I'll also share a link on disinformation from PEN America that's done some really great work on that as well.
Thank you. And so we're going to go right into it, to a Q&A, and we do have a question that I'm going to give to Stephen, which is, are there any thoughts on if the ADA or the IDEA can protect if generally accepted DEI is placed in question at our schools?
Yeah, this is a nuanced question. So this is the American with Disabilities Act, and IDEA is the Individual with Disabilities Education Act. Whether it can protect if generally accepted diversity and equity inclusion is placed in question in our schools, I'm not sure about that, because to Noah's point, this is so nebulous. The way that people talk about, the way that people conflate critical race theory, the 1619 Project, Professor Kendi's anti-racist work, diversity and equity inclusion, means that if there's an attack on one part of it, it can be a little bit of a moving target. I find that most of the the policies that have been put in place to try to undermine, let's say, teaching critical race theory in schools or diversity and equity and inclusion, their real power is in that soft diplomatic power, the chilling effect. What will it look like to for a lot of our teachers of color to leave the profession if they feel like they're not going to be protected during a contract fight? What does it look like to be fearful that parents are going to target you because you are a woman of color on a school board? And so I would be surprised if any of these kind of policy works actually get to that level, because the bigger fight isn't for individual school board motions. The bigger fight is for us as voters. This is what kind of this comes from, as Noah mentioned. It's meant as a way to split, we'll say, white liberals from people of color in the Democratic Party, or at least that's how it's been used regularly. And so I actually don't put a lot of emphasis on this actually being meant as a way for policy change, but rather as a kind of a response to what a lot of people saw was this overwhelming movement in wake of George Floyd's killing, and seeing public perception for a time go view favorably Black Lives Matter. I think that this kind of fits more along the lines of when we saw kind of cultural fights against Sharia law. You know, we saw that, was that 10 years ago, that we need to stop Sharia law from entering into our schools and into our communities. And it is just as preposterous in that way. And so I don't think there's actually policies necessarily going on the line, at least not what we've seen yet in Georgia. More, it's just a posture against more broadly power being shifted towards community of color and or better understanding what white supremacist policies have done in the United States. And Noah, what do you think about that? If you think that I got that one wrong?
No, Dr. Stephen, I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. And from my limited, just thinking about both of those from law school, these puppies, they're not stupid. I'm sorry. They just keep running in here. But I think, can they generally? No, I mean, I think part of the problem is that it really, like, that's federal law, and nothing that schools do can undermine those things. Now, Mindy, you might know this if you have a child or anyone in your life or any parent that has had to deal with at the ADA or IDA or any of that stuff, IEPs, things of that nature. There are tons of issues that can occur in terms of getting the needs services. So what can happen potentially is that all this fighting around equity, if you have not that like Stephen was saying, not that we'll have actual policy happen, but what we can have is what we've seen happening already with the Cobb School Board, for example, that passed its resolution and didn't seem to know what it was actually even passing. We can't have people putting pressure on teachers. We can't have people, making comments and doing things that make people kind of capitulate in ways that could potentially cause harm. I mean, that's all speculation and conjecture. But we want people to have is the right information, and we want to make sure that in a spirit of claiming that they're trying to protect children, that we don't actually harm children, right? And so I do think that when they're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion in schools, we do need to be considerate of disability, and absolutely, and gender orientation and sexual identity, right? Because these are things that are also being threatened in some of the language that is used with the way they talk about things. And I'm still trying to pull these other links to share in the chat with y'all. But I think, Stephen, you had that absolutely right.
Awesome. Thank you both. So now we have a question that either one of you can stab at. I don't know who's following DeSantis legislation here. And so the question was basically DeSantis path related to public universities and schools to complete a survey. Does anyone understand where that was going, or was that just his way to hedge the conversation at schools that are funded by the state? Which then brings me back to our issue with Georgia Southern and the burning of the books and the kids, but we can go into that. We can find all those connecting dots. So either one of you can grab at this one.
Yeah, so I would just say that that is following up. It's expanding upon what he's already done with the law passed banning the teaching of critical race theory in public schools. And so this specifically, it's completing a survey about their beliefs. It's I just double checked. It is faculty and students because in his opinion, and this is my little quip about indoctrination earlier, in his opinion, public universities and college campuses are intellectually repressive places. And there are concerns from parents about their students being indoctrinated in these institutions. And this only applies to public institutions since they would be getting their funding. My position has been that professors and students alike need to refuse to do this because this sounds like the setup for a witch hunt to either weed people out in terms of professors or to either maybe limit or remove funding. It'd be interesting to see what happens in terms of how they try to do things in terms of funding. And I mean, arguably, like my godmother, who I mentioned earlier, she teaches at a private law school in Florida because I had actually asked her, I forgot her school was private and not public. And I asked her, like, how will the law he signed, the previous law signed, how would that affect her? She's like, they can't tell us what to do. And so she and I were going back and forth about legality. And so there are questions of legality with a lot of this stuff, right? But the problem is that a lot of people are literally scared of repercussions in the interim while the legal stuff sorts itself out. So what he just passed actually is a real chilling effect that goes even further than what a Kansas lawmaker did by sending a request to the heads of universities demanding copies of syllabi to understand what is being taught. He's going directly and basically playing thought police, it sounds like.
Hello, I lost y'all. Sorry. Welcome. So, Stephen, Stephen, do you want to speak on that, or just think about? I think for the context of grounding us in like George's work, what are like the dangerous possibilities, like, or things that we should stand up and fight for in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I can just speak generally to that point because the legislation that Noah just mentioned is almost assuredly unconstitutional, right? That if there is a registration of socialist professors, that is completely within their right as Americans to be socialist professors, right? And so what I kind of want to zoom out just a little bit, that absolutely there are real world harms to Noah's point. There are real world harms to this posturing. If we have a teacher workforce that feels like they're not protected and we lose more teachers of color, that is going to do real harm to children of color in the state. We see that in the research and white students as well that can benefit, that do benefit from having teachers of color. But I don't want us to get stuck just trying to correct the grammar and notes of whomever is deciding the agenda for us, whoever is kind of picking the fight. Because I think that we can kind of get stuck in the wake of controversies like these and say, okay, actually, that's not what critical race theory is. Or actually, it's really helpful for children to have teachers of color. And we end up kind of correcting facts when really we should be in the place of painting a picture moving forward of what our schools look like when every child is valued, like their entirety, not just the part of them that can become a future worker, not just the part of them that how close they are to white spaces, or how able their body is, or how well they know English, but painting a picture of a school system, a high quality neighborhood school that by law accepts every single child and provides them an opportunity that is world class. And I think that we have a chance to paint that picture, and that sort of image where we don't. So I mentioned, Angela Davis, absolutely. So that image is already going to cut the knees out of debates like these. That we can then start to show what it looks like where all children benefit if we do right by those who have historically and continue to be held back because of white supremacist or ableist or like racist xenophobic policies. And so that is the difficult part, is that we want to be able to fight these battles kind of where they show up, but also we want to recognize that there's a greater war, which is casting a future in Georgia where every single child is given an opportunity, not just the ones who don't want to feel racist.
Thank you. So Anoa's been giving us some great resources. I want you to take some time to elaborate on that. And this will be like sort of our wind down, y'all, because we're getting a lot of comments, not a lot of questions, which comments are great. So Anoa, go ahead and give us like let us know about these great resources that you're sharing. Then Stephen, I want you to come back and talk about Fund Georgia's Future better than I did in the chat, so that's how we're going to move for the next few minutes, y'all.
Very cool. Just to follow up on what Stephen was saying too, just like my friend whose house I'm in, her 15-year-old has way better style than I do. But my friend whose house I'm in, when our sons, also at the same elementary school, were 19 years old, maybe 10, she sat her son down. They're white. She sat her son down and was like, you say that my son Max is your brother. This is what the world's going to look like for him. And so she had the boys read for a summer reading project, Walter Dean Meyer's book, Monster. I was so blown away that she did that, right? Like, I have some great friends, I'm sure lots of you all do, but I haven't had anyone in my life that actually took it upon herself to do that with her children. So that it's like, okay, fine, this is a family we're close to, we love each other, that's like your brother and sister, and the boys really are inseparable. So she made sure her son also was on the same page with mine. And so I followed up, and the boys read 2 more of Walter Dean Meyer's books together, right? And so it means a lot when people like understand that we all live in this society and in these communities together, and we may experience like same thing if folks have disabilities, same thing if folks are LGBTQ, like we exist and we should understand each other. So the resources that I am providing, I'm not sure what order you're getting them in. One is the NBC News article that I mentioned previously. Another 1 or 2 are probably links to some of the guidance that are being given to conservative groups about how to attack critical race theory in your schools. Like, one actually has like the language to use and like what it's synonymous with. So just so you can see that this isn't like some coincidental conspiracy theory. This is really something that someone's doing. Another thing is a report that I just dropped that I had downloaded that was done by some researchers, I think up in Massachusetts, maybe, about disinformation, specifically about race and social groups and how it has influenced opinions and conversations since I think maybe 2016. And then I also dropped in a link a link from Penn America about disinformation, how to approach it, how to tackle it. And they also have some good resources about how to talk to people in your life. You just have to use your judgment about whether or not someone is worth having a conversation with. Some people, it's like they are really entrenched in their thinking, and it might be more frustrating for you than fruitful to have that conversation. But there are a lot of people out there who it is very useful, because I'm pretty sure most of the folks who are getting kind of like caught up in I really wish we could just have just school, don't really understand that doesn't really mean much for a lot of families for various reasons.
Thank you. And Stephen, tell us what's on the ground. What's next for what can we get involved with in Georgia?
Yeah, so Fund Georgia's Future, Amanda and I have been working in this brand new coalition where right now we're just a steering committee and a vision and a few resources that we put together. But the goal is a just educational system. And Amanda's been really helpful in that, making sure that steering committee organizations, which are a lot of regional, some grassroots, some Just Georgia groups, where we want to make sure we're not fighting for just one bill. We really want to fight for the increase of justice inside K through 12 schools. And one of the ways that we're trying to be hyper-focused is through fair and full funding. And we have these commitments that we believe that if the state actually commits to fair and full funding, then it's going to have to be inclusive, meaning like listening to the community, to all communities. It's going to need to acknowledge and work to dismantle historical systems of marginalization in public schools. We need to have a commitment of maintenance and growth. And I don't have to go into each of those in detail, but the idea is we are tired of just respectfully putting the bowl in front of the Georgia legislature and say, like, hey, whatever crumbs y'all got, we'll take it. Thank you so much for not firing every single teacher in Georgia. We're watching other states that have like strong pushback to hold their lawmakers accountable. That's Democrats and Republicans, to actually provide enough funds, equitable funds to public schools. And we are jealous for a movement like that. And so they're putting in the chat our survey that we would love for you to take. Check out our Facebook page as we provide resources on advocates and how to advocate at your local school board and how to better understand school funding. I'm thinking about how that scene in the play Fences, where the dad is talking to his son, and his son says, "Why don't you like me?" And the dad says, I don't have to like you, but I have a duty and a responsibility to do right by you. And so even if we're not going to be able to make Georgia lawmakers fully respect every person in their unique place, like race, gender, religion, language proficiency, country of origin, we can still put pressure on them to do right by you, to actually pay so that every child has the same opportunity. And so that's what we're trying to do, is trying to get the state of Georgia to do its constitutional responsibility for all its citizens.
Awesome. I'm going to throw that link to our chat moderator so they can get it to those folks. The survey is important, y'all. Like, we need as many people filling it out as possible to hear from y'all in order to actually advocate for what we're thinking is like the best equitable way to fund Georgia's future here. And like, usually we're literally talking about children. So let's all stay focused about that. Are there, like, I'm not one to keep time. The comments are coming. So that question, so there is a question, and I don't know if we want to like bridge that gap or if Noah's open for it, but I don't like, I don't know if that's where we are right now, which is one of the questions was, how is the new voting laws affecting students?
I don't know if we quite know how it may have an impact on, I mean, it'd be great if people started doing more high school registration days, which is actually something that can actually happen under existing law. To my knowledge, that did not change in the existing law. I do think that, I mean, we have some of the most amazing, like, I'm in West Virginia because I'm supposed to be covering the Black Voters Matter bus tour, but I missed the rally because of bad traffic. But we have some of the most amazing people doing voting rights and civic engagement work in the state, that they are so amazing that they took that good energy across the South, and both NGP, New Georgia Project, and Black Voters Matter, and a whole bunch of other organizations are in West Virginia right now because of the work that they have done when nobody else wanted to fund it and support it, and helping to bring those lessons and hopefully a little bit of support along with it to folks here in West Virginia. So I don't necessarily know that the new voting law will necessarily have a negative impact on students per se, but I do know that we have some of the most amazing folks, and Amanda has done some work with folks on the ground down in the Savannah area as well. So we have some of those amazing folks in the state that engage, and we need more people engaging young people, definitely.
Yes. So what I will, and on top of that, so I will say this, okay, so we're not, I don't want to like fill the space, but Stacey, we'll try to like have a board member address your questions around the voting because I see them in the chat. Well, we're talking about education. I really want us to stay on topic. So like one of the things that I really want to talk about in this moment is that there is a couple of $1 billion headed to Georgia. And we need everyone's voice to lift up the need for us to actually use those funds to address the learning loss, to address what equity looks like, to get, to provide the services and the needs as far as a COVID response and where, local school districts are coming up short. We just did an advocacy training with Fund Georgia's Future on how to advocate on your local state board. We have that up on our Facebook page. And what we really need right now is for folks all over these 159 counties. One, to start commenting, making public comment to the State Board of Education, not just about like these CRT resolutions, but about like being responsible fiscally to us as taxpayers. And then two, you need to start holding your local school boards accountable for transparency and accountability with these dollars. Like I don't want to be the fear mongering person about like, they could just sit on this money or backfill when we have this amazing opportunity to reimagine education. But I'm going to say that, and I'm going to say like, this is an amazing opportunity since education is on the forefront of people's minds to start questioning about, so if you guys are going to do this, what else are you doing? Because we know you're getting a serious amount of money from the American Rescue Plan. And for that, I'm just going to like close us out and wind us down. I want to thank everyone who was in attendance. I want to thank the panelists. I think, if anything, this is your opportunity to speak up. If you're mad about this, be mad about a bunch of other things, because we're only going to get better if we actually push for change. And so thank you, Georgia Alliance for Social Justice, for having us. There's Walks of Funds Cobb. I see that plug. They were great last night. They were on our advocacy training. They're stronger together as well. And just thank everyone for coming out. And I hope you guys got some great jewels from this, and have a great evening. Thank you.